This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 270. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your usual Clara article plug, Alan, is ZFS performance tuning in the real world. Arc, L2 Arc, and Slog.
Yeah, so as we continue our ZFS Basecamp series, we're adding more articles to the maintenance and tuning section. And this one covers some of the decisions that go into deciding how you should size your arc, what settings you should use, do you need an L2 arc, and when is a slog helpful?
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. We seem to be seeing hard drive shortages recently, and some people think that it might be AI's fault.
Yeah, a lot of this hype around AI causing surges in demand for both hard drives and server-grade SSDs. It's starting to cause problems. It's also apparently affecting RAM pretty badly as well. And part of it is, in all those cases, it seems the manufacturers are not rushing to stand up more capacity because they don't want to be standing around with all that capacity if the AI bubble has a reset.
When it bursts, you mean?
More just a reset of expectations to be maybe a little less exuberant.
You don't think we're always going to be building 10 gigawatt data centers for this stuff, Alan? That's not just, the new normal?
Something like that. We've seen price hikes coming and so on because of the shortage, but I think it also fits in something we talked about probably a month or so ago on, when Seagate did the raid and found the people that were resetting smart and so on. Every time there is a hard drive shortage and it gets harder, long back order times or really high prices to buy brand new hard drives, people turn to the secondary market like eBay and so on. And so I expect to see a lot more shenanigans on the Water Panther drives and the drives where the smart data has been screwed with to make it look like the drive is not as old and used up as it actually is.
Part of this, I think, is a little bit inescapable. We're seeing more of these kinds of hitches and glitches in the supply chain basically as fads strike the industry. And I think it's as much just a phenomenon of, we've got a very interconnected world these days, and it's a lot more possible for a fad to take off in a way that literally impacts the entire planet. I mean, right now, AI is the fad. Before this, it was blockchain stuff. Remember when we couldn't get hard drives because of Chia? It just basically we have gotten to a point in the world economy where everything is so interconnected and so just in time that whenever one thing changes, you can see the effects everywhere else.
Well, it even goes back to the bigger shortages of hard drives we saw when there were the floods in Thailand because, we're down to basically two manufacturers of hard drives and one of them got hit with a natural disaster and it took a long time to recover. And I think to your point about chasing the fads, some of the manufacturers chased Chia pretty hard and got bit when it all crumbled to nothing. And so I think they're much more hesitant to chase the fad this time. And they're like, if it drives prices up, we're not really going to complain. Where else are you going to buy a hard drive?
Yeah, it's a lot more sensible to just kind of, sell them for what the market will bear than to scale your manufacturer way, way, way up to feed a demand that you're pretty sure can't last for very long.
Yeah, and it's like everybody's also eyeing up NVIDIA and being like, well, can we do what they did? But from the side, especially of our listeners, I think it means having to be a lot more careful about where you're sourcing hard drives from. And again, relating back to that Seagate story, Seagate's really cracking down and making sure that legitimate vendors that are selling drives have to have sourced them from somewhere that has signed with Seagate the pledge to not let these tainted drives into the supply chain. We talk a lot about the integrity of supply chain on the software side and even on the chip side and the IT side, but it isn't a nation state trying to give you infected hardware this time. It is organized crime in Asia trying to sell you a used hard drive as a new one.
To be fair, that's arguably because better organized crime has eaten up all of the legitimate market, but, whatever, kick the can down the road a little bit.
Well, and it's why I would only buy Seagate at this point, because they have the farm data. I talked about this whenever it was a month or so ago. The other manufacturers, Toshiba and Western Digital, you can reset the smart data and there's no way to know. it can look completely brand new, but at least for now, with a Seagate drive, you can look at that farm data and know for sure whether it's new or not.
Honestly, at the moment right now, Seagate is far and away at the top of my personally ordered list of the 3 vendors that we have to choose from. Seagate's up at the top because they're actually talking. When things happen in the industry, Seagate reps come out and they talk about it, and the things they say make sense, and they're not obvious, easy to pin right back on their butt lies. That puts them above Western Digital, and the fact that they talk at all puts them above Toshiba. So if my choices are, I have 3 vendors available, one of whom actually talks to the press and says reasonable things when they do and hasn't been caught lying in a while, another which has been caught with its hand in the cookie jar nonstop, and another one that might as well be a ghost of the 20th century that nobody's ever heard from. I don't know. It's an easy choice for me. The one other thing I think we probably ought to say before we close this topic out is, in addition to being careful where your hard drives are sourced from, or maybe even alternatively to just absolutely sweating it as hard as possible where you're sourcing your drives from, make sure you're doing your homework the way you're supposed to do it every day, the way we preach it every day on this show, no matter what anyway. You need to have redundancy. You need to have backup. If you have redundancy and if you have backup, you'll be okay. If you don't, and you won't. It really is that simple, folks.
I keep seeing people expressing a sentiment about self-hosting and that not being the answer. And back in the summer, there was a piece by Drew Lighton called "The Future is Not Self-Hosted." And I've kind of been thinking about it ever since. The point that Drew makes in this piece, and that I've heard echoed elsewhere, is that it's not really that useful for individuals to self-host their own storage and services and everything. And what we should have is publicly accessible, interoperable data and services using open standards that is potentially even funded via taxpayers' money.
So we ought to have things like HTML and HTTP and TCP/IP, stuff like that, open standards that, let wildly different technologies interoperate and communicate with each other. That sounds novel. I like this idea.
Well, we shouldn't have some people stuff in Google Drive, some people stuff in Dropbox, some people stuff in Apple, iCloud or whatever. We should have genuine open standards.
Well, we do have genuine open standards. I just listed a bunch of them. There's lots more. Would you like me to list some more of them?
No, but why are people's only choices either silo it off in some company's services or silo it off in my house?
Who says that's their only choices? Anybody who wants to and has $5 in their pocket can go rent a VM from DigitalOcean or Linode or Vultr or Silk or a million other places and do whatever they want to it using all kinds of open protocols and applications and standards. You can set up a web page. You can do email hosting. You can set up Mastodon instances. I mean, the sky's the limit. So what are you asking for that we don't have?
Well, to me, I would say running your own VPS is still self-hosting.
It is.
I would agree.
So I think rather than having the government involved in anything, that there are already things like little kind of collectives or cooperatives that will get one bigger server and host Nextcloud or whatever, the type of stuff you would self-host, but for a very small fee, around probably the same $5 you'd pay for a VPS that you control yourself, you could pay someone who's maybe better at it than you to manage your photo sharing service and keep that server updated and, like web hosting, but apps and whatever these things that you would self-host, but with a bunch of maybe like-minded people or people collected around a specific geographic area or an interest group or something where it would be, people like you that all want to not have to manage their own photo sharing app, but don't want to use Google. And for a very small fee, less probably than you would pay for either the power to host it in your house or the VPS to self-host it, they can do that. And it doesn't require a bunch of government or open standards or something. It just requires a group of people to actually want to do it, or people to be willing to pay a little bit of money for somebody to have the economic case to start the hosting company.
Well, see, now you're just right back to commercial hosting again. We have that too. For a second there, it sounded like you were angling after a cooperative. But in a cooperative, the folks do the work themselves as volunteers, and that doesn't work for this because we still need highly specialized talents that are uncommon to find in the general population, and particularly in people who don't do it for a living, in order to secure all this stuff that is going to be at a higher scale than just individually self-hosted because, we got a whole bunch of people's stuff on there. So we need somebody, who really knows what they're doing to do all of this. So we're back to commercial hosting. What else we got?
Part of Joe's point, I think, is he would like it if the Google Photos app had the option to host your files somewhere else, but I don't see that as forthcoming, really, or even as an avenue worth pursuing, probably. But I'm sure the EU could regulate that Google had to support you putting in whatever URL you wanted as the place to back up your photos.
Okay, so here's the thing that I found interesting about this topic. I do think that the title is correct. I can't say anything about the article because I haven't read it, but the title is very obviously correct as far as I'm concerned. No, the future is not self-hosted. And the reason it's not self-hosted is because most people aren't capable of self-hosting, and they never will be. When we talk about self-hosting, we're talking about giving somebody absolutely no holds barred a presence on the internet to do with as they will. And that is legal right now, but it's not practical for normal people. Normal people can't really do that. And if you force them to try, it would get really ugly really quickly because they have no idea what they're doing. And if you just create all of these unsecured servers all over the place managed by absolutely nobody, well, we already know what happens to an abandoned server that's being mismanaged or not managed. It turns into a weapon used by organized crime of one type or another, whether it's a script kiddie trying to knock down the game where somebody pissed him off, or more likely, whether it's, somebody trying to, send spam or proxy social media grifting, you name it.
Or just relaying AI scraping.
Yeah, there have to be some guardrails. We're not just talking about the inconsequential parts of being on the internet. We're not talking about just like picking your font on your MySpace page. We're talking about the potential for real harm and real damage, which means you can't scale it beyond the people who are capable of and willing to and, will actually follow all of the rules of the internet, spoken, unspoken, legal, extra legal, whatever, all the things that have to be in place to make the internet go. We can't trust the entirety of humanity with that. That's just not the way it works. They're not capable of it. They don't want to do it. They never will. So like a lot of the issue that we see right now, we talk about, things used to be so much better, back when it was more complicated. Well, the internet got set up by engineers for engineers. And, we had for a while, it was a very limited sub-society, but we had a society that was nothing but engineering type people and engineering capable type people, people who thought about this kind of stuff, people who would set up services and think about, interactions and all the rest of it. And we just have to accept that is not the entire human race. That's a tiny part of the human race. And whatever the future is, the future has to be for everybody, which means it has to be something everybody can participate in. And not everybody is ever going to be able to participate in self-hosting the way that we talk about self-hosting today.
And to Jim's point earlier, we wouldn't want them to because it would ruin the internet. Not because what they're hosting is a problem, but because mismanaged or unmanaged servers will be just that much more hardware that can be taken over by malactors.
All right, let me quote Drew in this piece. Imagine a world where your library card includes 100 gigabytes of encrypted file storage, photo sharing and document collaboration tools, and media streaming services, all for free. Your data is encrypted end-to-end, but is shareable to anyone on any other service through standardized protocols.
Does this person understand how encryption works? Because it can't be end-to-end encrypted and randomly decrypted to anybody who wants it or who you decide to share it with. That's not how that would work.
We can hand wave that away, Alan. There are ways to solve that. It could get funneled all the way back through the user's computer whenever they decide to share it, and that's where the decryption happens. There are options for that.
I suppose.
We'll hand wave that. I think it's more interesting just to point out that all that we're really talking about now is Google Drive that you didn't have to pay for. Okay, sounds nice. Sure. Hell, you can even bump my taxes up about $10 a year to pay for it. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, free at the point of delivery.
Well, nothing's truly free.
Indeed.
Heinlein might be long dead, but Tonstoffel is as valid as it ever was. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Nothing is truly free. But my point is that I don't think this changes much so far. Again, you're describing free Google Drive. I don't see that changing the world.
Your already underfunded library is going to do this how?
Well, I think part of what he's trying to say here is that there should be funding for this sort of stuff as well as libraries.
Sure, although I probably have a list of priorities that come higher than hosting whatever collection of photos Joe decides he needs to host.
You don't have a socialist bone in your body, do you, Alan?
I do. Like, I believe strongly in socialized healthcare. I would spend all the money on the healthcare and a bunch of things like that. And, I go so far as I don't think the government should contract out things like road maintenance, because if they need it all the time, then paying for the flexibility of a contractor is probably the wrong way to do it. And there are a bunch of other things that I believe that collectively the government should do a lot of things. I'm very socialist bones in my body. I just don't believe that 100 gigabytes of storage from your library is very high on my list. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm saying, on my, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's way at the top, and we're still trying to dig out of the pit underneath at the moment.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but you do have a basement full of hard drives.
I understand that I don't have as much a need for it.
I just don't think this changes anything. The idea here is that we're looking for something transformative, right? It's not just wouldn't it be nice if we had, like free Google One or whatever? Like, yeah, sure, that'd be nice. It'd be nice if I had a cheeseburger right now too. What's the point? And if we're looking for something transformative, I just don't think this is it. I think the people who really need something like Google One are already paying for it and using it. And I don't think that $10 is really making a big dent, or they'd particularly notice it if it went away. Meanwhile, the folks to whom $10 is a big deal and, this would make a difference to, there are probably much better ways to impact their lives. And honestly, in this particular case, if you're talking about 100 gigs for every, well, you're not in the United States, but let's say for every citizen of my own country, the United States, well, that's 300 million people, each of whom get 100 gigs, and you have to maintain that for that person's entire life. That is actually a really significant project that's kind of outside the scope of any of the departments of the United States government that I'm aware of. And I don't think I really want them to try to provide that, honestly. I think in that case, it probably would make more sense to sub it out and just be like, you know what? At least for now, courtesy of Uncle Sam, you guys all get some Google Drive. Yay, have fun.
I have other concerns about the UK. It seems very anti end-to-end encrypted anything. So I don't really see a lot of governments sponsoring a service where you can store whatever you want encrypted in a way that they can't ever access.
Now, with all that said, so it's not just me being a negative Nelly the entire time. I think that there does need to be some sort of a shift towards something that empowers more people when it comes to tech in the future. I don't think that the non-engineering people have as much of an ability to express themselves and are able to use the internet to the degree that they ought to be able to. The issue is that, unfortunately, this is our domain as the engineering type folks who work on this stuff. Like, we have to figure out ways to empower those people in the same ways that, somebody who spends their entire life farming figures out how to feed you. I haven't done a whole lot in the way of directly feeding myself or plumbing or wiring my houses. I've done a little bit here and there, but my point is, we all do things for each other, right? And this is literally the thing that we're supposed to be doing for the people who do the other thing for us. We're supposed to be figuring out, like, how do we use all this technical stuff in ways to empower you and make your missions go? And we still have a long way to go to figure that out. I definitely agree that, honestly, I'll even say Joe Sixpack has probably taken a step back. And like, their ability to truly express themselves, I think it's lower now than it was 20 years ago. I think that the average person had more control over their silly little MySpace page than they do in the modern landscape of social media.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Joe writes, I'm looking to build a rack-mounted server in the next few months. I was wondering what Epic line you would recommend to start out with to do some virtualization on containers, and obviously set up a ZFS array to store it all on. I know Epic isn't cheap, so I was thinking about starting my budget around 2K for the setup, but could go a little above that for the best all-round setup. Any recommendations are appreciated.
The answer to the question what Epic CPU is best to start out with for this project is moo. You should not be starting out with an Epic server for this project. Epics are great. They are very hard to come by, have been for quite a few years, and are extraordinarily expensive. You really can't just go down to the corner shop and buy an Epic and a board and, put the two together and go about your life. Unfortunately, getting Epics right now means a relative few vendors, all of whom charge very high markups and want to sell you entire systems, not just an inexpensive CPU on a board. For what you want to do, I think AMD is the right answer. It's just the Epic part that you're wrong about, and pretty much any of the modern Ryzens will really do quite well. The big thing that I would warn you about is if you're getting a modern Ryzen, one of the ones that uses DDR5 RAM, don't go over 64 gigs of RAM. The DDR5 stuff is not real stable with more than 2 sticks right now, so be very careful about that.
That probably depends a bit on the motherboard. A lot of AMD motherboards recommend against not having populated all the slots of the one color or something, but it depends, again, on the motherboard and architecture. For a lot of builds that I've done recently for customers, we've gone with the Epic 9124, but to Jim's point, at CDW right now, that processor's over $1,200 just for the chip. So building a whole system for 2K when you're spending more than half of that on just the CPU is not likely to work out for you. What I'd do, especially for a budget like that, and you didn't mention use case, but if this is home lab, right, you're considering building a rack mount server the next few months to do some virtualization containers, you might look at something like UnixSurplus.com for slightly older gear, not very old, but slightly older, where you're going to get a high enough core count to be able to run a bunch of VMs and some containers and do it at a lot less of a premium than getting the latest Epic hardware.
Although, again, please don't be afraid of the consumer stuff. You don't have to get, obsoleted server-grade hardware. One of the major things that you'll get out of going with server-grade rather than consumer-grade hardware is typically a lot more noise and heat generated because they are designed to run in data centers. They are not designed to be easy to live with in a residential space. So maybe you've got a workstation that you're thinking about upgrading. Maybe you just go ahead and, build a whole new desktop box and your last desktop becomes the basis of this build. You don't have to have an incredible amount of firepower to build a virtualization appliance. You need a decent CPU with a few threads and you need some RAM. And that's really about all you need. So again, I would say if you come across a deal that you love on exactly the rack mount kit that you want, you can find some great deals. There are various sites online. I've used server part deals for quite a bit of this stuff. But again, don't feel like you need to do that. You don't have to go server grade here, and it may not even be what serves you best within your budget.
Yeah, to that point, I remember looking a couple of years ago when one of the developers on my team was buying a little mini PC, like 1 liter PC thing to do some builds at home. And when we compared the specs and the actual performance of the Ryzen that he bought, which was I think almost a mobile grade Ryzen, to my dual socket but old first generation Intel CPU, he was blowing my 40 thread machine out of the water with a 16 thread Ryzen and using a lot less power and making no noise. So to Jim's point, you might be better off spending most of the money on RAM because that's likely going to be the thing that limits how many VMs you can run.
And if your budget is 2,000-ish, including drives, then you've really not got much to play with, have you?
Especially if you want flash.
There's really not a lot there, so it's going to boil down to use that budget the most effectively that you can, and don't get stars in your eyes. Thinking that you've got to have super crazy unobtainium special equipment. You really don't. Consumer grade stuff works very well indeed for virtualization. I have a lot of real honest-to-God money-making businesses that are on consumer hardware because it was the right choice.
Yeah, most of the stuff in my original home lab was exactly as Jim described. Every time I upgraded my PC, the old one went into the home lab. The only reason it's a bit different now is because from my previous company, I have a bunch of cast-off server-grade hardware and a place to put it where I don't mind the noise. But when I'm looking at stuff for my new house, it's all much quieter and not really server grade. I will miss the IPMI a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal for me to go downstairs to fiddle the machine rather than having to do it remotely.
You'd be amazed at how much you can get done these days, even with just like a little mini PC. If you haven't built out a rack and you very specifically have, bays to fill in a rack, you might want to reconsider like a lot of things about, make a home lab that you can really live with. It's easy to deal with. It fits in your space. It's easy to work in. And in a lot of cases, in an actual home, that does not mean an 18-inch relay rack. It means like a little cart or some shelves off in the corner, and you can get these little off-lease Dell small form factor Optiplex boxes. You can do a surprising amount with those. If you want to buy stuff new, I really like Minis Forum. They make these little tiny mini PCs that can be VESA mounted to the back of a monitor, or you can just fit like 15 of the things on a shelf if you felt like going that way. But they're reasonably inexpensive. They're easy to work on. They're low power. You'd be surprised at how much you can actually fit in the way of RAM and storage into a, teeny tiny, like palm top sized box. So think creatively, look at what you've got, think about what you need, and think about the best way to get there. Don't constrain yourself with thinking you have to have one specific type of hardware to get the job done, because you don't.
Yeah, I know Serve the Home a couple of weeks ago had an article about a tiny, like, Minis Forum style box that was a NAS, and it just had 4 or 6 M2 slots. And so it was going to be like an all-flash NAS, but in like a 1-liter PC that would take up no space and, in this case, have no moving parts.
Yeah, and if you want to go super cheap with the end of Windows 10, anything 7th gen Intel or older is basically dirt cheap now. Now, you're not going to get the best performance out of that, but some of those i7s have got a fair core count. And if you combine that with loads of RAM, depending on your needs, if it is just a home lab, you could potentially set something up for like a few $100.
Yeah, you could potentially grab a lot of hardware for next to nothing if you're willing to go for that pre-Windows 11 spec. The 7th gen or 6th gen CPUs are older, and pick up older stuff. If you really want to like learn and you want to have some flexibility to do a lot of stuff, get 3 laptops that are too old to run Windows 11 on them, and install your favorite versions of whatever operating systems on them. And you can do a lot of things. You can host more virtual machines. You can have a production hotspare DR type setup, like I talk about always on the show. You have a lot of possibilities beyond like I spent $2,000 on this one box and it's almost what I wanted it to be.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.